Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I will kick off and then I'll offer the call to other senators. And Ms Chester, I'll initially direct my questions to you, and thank you for your opening statement updating on when ASIC's internal audit team found out about these matters, because I will have some subsequent questions about that specifically. As you know, as you may know, I'm filling in for Senator Brockman here in the Economics Committee, but the other hat that I normally wear is as Chair of the Corporations and Financial Services Committee, which is the primary oversight committee of ASIC. And I have to say, in that capacity, I'm very concerned by the events of the past week, not just the instances of these two payments which may have been incorrectly paid, but what it appears to suggest about ASIC's internal processes and procedures and decision-making. And in particular, two matters raised by the ANAO in their letter to the Treasurer on the 22nd of October leapt out at me. The first is, and I'm going to have to read it in full for the appropriate context, the Auditor-General says, "I consider these as important matters to bring to your attention as they relate to the stewardship by the accountable authority of taxpayer resources, particularly with respect to payments made to the benefit of the accountable authority. Further, I formed the view during the course of the audit that in order to gain greater confidence that appropriate action would be taken, I should indicate that I would bring the matter to your attention." Ms Chester, why did the Auditor-General feel that in order to gain confidence that appropriate action would be taken, he would have to write to the Treasurer and to indicate to ASIC that he was doing so?
Thank you, Senator. Far be it from me to understand the detailed thinking of the Auditor-General in coming to that conclusion, but based on my knowledge of the events and the materials that the Auditor-General has worked through, I think it's fair to say that given there is an issue around the appropriateness of the payments that were made on behalf of Mr Shipton, who was at the time the accountable authority, and then the clear failings in the processes around the approvals for those payments, that the accountable authority being involved in the matter, a breach of the PGPA, a breach of the CPR, would of course prompt an Auditor-General to think of writing a Section 26 letter to the Minister, and that's what's happened here. So we do take this as very serious. Indeed, when the full Commission became aware of the seriousness of this matter, before we received the draft management letter from the Auditor-General, myself and Chief Counsel Chris Sabundra met with Mr Grant Hare, the Auditor-General, myself and Commissioner Sean Hughes met with the Auditor-General, and after receipt of the draft management letter, we also met again with the Auditor-General, Mr Grant Hare, to discuss and get a better understanding of his concerns so we could work through an appropriate response to his findings and his recommendations.
Ms Chester, I agree with you that the matters identified in this audit process would have always been sufficiently serious for the Auditor-General to write to the Treasurer, but I think that paragraph goes further than that, and I think it suggests something wider than that. He's not just writing to the Treasurer in order to bring it to the Treasurer's attention, which would be appropriate. He's saying that he needs to write to the Treasurer to bring it to his attention, and that he needs to inform ASIC that he will do so because of things which became clear to him during the course of the audit. It appears to be suggesting that he encountered some internal resistance or reluctance or reticence on the part of ASIC to address these issues or to take them seriously, and that's what's caused him to form the view that this had to be brought to the specific attention of the Treasurer.
So 2 points. That's a very good question. Thank you, Mr Chairman. 2 points I'd make there. Firstly, informal feedback, both in the course of this preparation of the final management letter and the Section 26 letter, the feedback that we had from Mr Grant Hare on behalf of ASIC staff and the non-recused commissioners was both constructive and we were very helpful, and we provided all the documents based on the questions we received from the ANAO. Indeed, at the conclusion of the audit of our financial statements, which went through with only the disclosure notes in the annual report that were tabled last Friday, again, in writing from the audit ANAO was positive feedback on the facilitative nature of the engagement between our staff and the ANAO. Our staff and our finance team in particular have built up an incredibly constructive and professional relationship with the ANAO over ongoing years. And in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, you would appreciate why I thought that was such an important point to make, that the nature of these payments were brought to the attention of the ANAO during the course of the audit, and it was after they were raised by our staff with the ANAO that the ANAO then had cause for concern about them.
Well, I will come to that because I think there's a longer history to that question. Just finally on this issue, as it happens, I also chair the committee that the ANAO appears before for estimates, and I certainly don't claim to have read every piece of correspondence that the Auditor General has ever written. But this struck me as a very unusual and very pointed observation that he made. It is not normal for the Auditor General to write to a minister and say that in order to gain greater confidence that appropriate action was taken, I'm bringing the matter to your attention. That I'm not aware of any precedent for that, and I put on the record I'm open to being corrected, but I'm not aware of that. This is an exceptional thing for the Auditor General to do.
Mr. Chairman, I agree. I'm not aware of a precedent for a Section 26 letter to a minister. From my own personal experience of about 18 years of public sector life, but also that of discussions that I had with the Acting Treasury Secretary at the time. The Treasury portfolio is not aware of that as well. So we do take this incredibly seriously. We have spent the last 4.5 weeks, the 4 commissioners and acting chair that appear before you today, working diligently with the ANAO to resolve this matter, to give the ANAO some comfort that we accept and acknowledge the findings, and to work constructively with the ANAO on their recommendations, all but one which is now moot because a repayment has been made. We have adopted, and indeed we had very constructive discussions with the Auditor General about the nature of the review. Indeed, it was our suggestion that it be an independent review.
Okay, moving on to the issue which you partly addressed in your opening statement on the question of when these issues were identified and by whom they were identified. The other issue which caused great concern for me in the Auditor General's letter to the Treasurer was on the second page when he says, in ANO's 2018-19 closing report issued in early August 2019, recommended that that ASIC seek advice from the Remuneration Tribunal on the classification of these payments and whether they fell within the Remuneration Tribunal determination. As at the end of September 2020, this had not occurred. Following the release of our draft finding to ASIC on this matter on 6 October 2020, ASIC communicated that the total amount of accommodation support provided would be repaid by the Deputy Chair as a debt to the Commonwealth. So it appears that ANAO, in fact, had identified this issue of Mr Crennan's travel allowance payment in a previous financial year, had brought it to the attention of ASIC and nothing was done about it. How can that be?
So just 2 initial comments on that, Mr Chairman. So firstly, and we agree and accepted in our response to the Auditor General that the delay in dealing with that matter is a failing. So we acknowledge that, we accept that. 2 comments that I thought might be helpful contextually. Firstly, that that wasn't a recommendation from the ANAO, that was an observation that they made in their final management letter on page 15. And
they have characterised it as a recommendation.
It's not a finding nor a recommendation, it's an observation on page 15.
Well, in this letter, perhaps the Auditor General's wrong, but that would be a bold claim to make in this context. He says they recommended that ASIC seek advice from the Remuneration Tribunal.
So I think there's a distinction in Auditor General management letters where there are formal recommendations and formal findings, and then there are observations where they suggest that a course of action be taken. So, and I'm not trying to be...
Yeah, can I suggest that's a very fine distinction to draw in these circumstances, Ms Chester?
It is when you're talking about an Auditor General recommendation. That said, we accepted, the accountable authority at the time accepted that observation, and there was some endeavour undertaken by ASIC during that period, and I'm happy to run through some of that with you if you'd like, Mr Chairman. But in now being fully briefed of these matters myself, along with Commissioner Hughes, Commissioner Armour and Commissioner Press, who were not fully aware of these matters at the time, I can see that it is incredibly glacial in pace in terms of how it's been dealt with. It is a complex matter. Referring the matter to the Remuneration Tribunal, indeed our staff did raise the matter with the Remuneration Tribunal. They said because the payments had already been made, the ANAO was not in a position to make a retrospective determination. Thus, it needed the involvement of the Treasurer. So there were ongoing discussions with Treasury, a briefing from Treasury, then Treasury wanted ASIC to go to the Remuneration Tribunal, so we thought we'd best get legal advice. We secured and obtained legal advice, and by that time we're at the end of the financial year. So, I'm not excusing Mr. Chairman, I'm not excusing how long this has taken.
I understand, but I don't accept your characterisation that it was merely glacial. On the Auditor-General's evidence in his letter to the Treasurer, it was just simply not addressed until it was raised for a second time. It was brought to ASIC's attention. According to the Attorney-General, the Auditor-General, no action was taken. It was raised a second time and then action was taken. So it wasn't glacial, it was non-existent.
So there were actions taken, but the matter was not resolved. I agree with that.
On what date were the actions taken in response to the first raising of this issue with ASIC?
So just bear with me, please, Mr. Chairman. So in August 2019, there were discussions with the Remuneration Tribunal. ASIC had ongoing discussions with them. At that time, the Remuneration Tribunal indicated that it was retrospective and the Treasurer's involvement and seeking of a waiver would be required. That was prior to the ANAO closing letter. There were then briefings, internal briefings of both the accountable authority and Mr. Crennan. There was then an ASIC submission that was prepared to go to the Remuneration Tribunal, further briefings of the Chair and Mr. Crennan. ASIC requested AGS to prepare a formal Remuneration Tribunal submission in May. Now, there was a significant delay there, but you might recall from March onwards, there were matters of COVID-19 that had our Chief Legal Office working on urgent matters. I'm not excusing any of this, I'm just trying to provide the context to the committee.
I appreciate that, and we're trying to get to the bottom of it to understand it, because these reporting of these actions is welcome, but it appears that the payments continued throughout this time despite the concerns being raised. Is that not correct?
That is correct. It wasn't until we were in receipt of final legal advice this year that Mr. Crennan requested that the payments cease, and after we received the draft management letter from the ANAO.
With respect, Ms Chester, it shouldn't be up to Mr Crennan to ask that the payments cease. If the Auditor-General tells ASIC during its audit process that a payment being made to one of your Deputy Commissioner, your Deputy Chair, is potentially not within the guidelines, why was it not immediately ceased until clarity was available, clear about whether it was in fact within the guidelines?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're asking me a question that should be put to Mr. Shipton.
Well, unfortunately, I can't do that.
I've explained the background, the context and the documentation and the chronology as I understand it, but it's fair to say that we did not have a full information set.
Okay, I'll move on to two other matters briefly, then I'll offer the call to Labor senators, and I thank other committee members for their patience. Ms Armour, is it the case that you are the responsible for the internal audit function at ASIC?
Kathy, you're on mute.
We don't have you, Ms Armour. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now or not?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. It is not the case. I'm not responsible for the internal audit function at ASIC. I am the Commissioner who sits on the ASIC Audit Committee.
Right. You'll have to explain to me what the distinction there is. You're the Commissioner with responsibility for audit. Is that not correct?
So the way our structure works is the internal audit function technically reports to the accountable authority. That is the way that structure works in most areas. The Audit Committee, which comprises 3 independent members and myself, reports principally to the Accountable Authority.
Okay, so you are the Commissioner on the Audit Committee.
That's right.
Okay, well, from your experience then on the Audit Committee, can you explain how the function works?
So the Audit Committee meets and reviews the financial statements and the control system around those financial statements, and tests those controls, and reviews the work of the Internal Audit Committee, makes recommendations to the Commission and the Accountable Authority on the internal audit plans, and follows up on matters of significant risks which are identified in internal audit plans. The Audit Committee has at its meetings each year, there are 4 times a year, 4 times in a special meeting to consider the financial statements. It has at its meetings the members of the ANAO who are conducting ASIC's audit.
How do you choose which issues you focus on when conducting an internal audit?
So we divide our internal audit program into a number of components. We have some compliance components, we have some performance components, and we have effectively some statutory financial audits, if you like, components. We have a rolling cycle. We tend to have the cycle over 2 years, and we focus on financial audits, and compliance reviews are generally quite fixed. They're around key financial risks. Performance audits are generally based on operational risks that are identified by senior management, by the Commission, with the input from the other members of the Audit Committee. We also take into account the work of the ANAO across the Commonwealth and their areas of interest and focus.
Do you produce internal reports?
Yes, we do.
Who are they made available to?
The internal audit reports are made available to the Audit Committee. They are available to the ANAO when they're attending our meetings. They are made available to the ASIC risk committees. We have an Executive Risk Committee and a Commission Risk Committee.
Did either the last financial year's 2018-19 internal audit report or the 2019-20 internal audit report identify the issues that were raised by the ANAO?
So the issues that were raised by the ANAO related to questions around the remuneration of statutory officers. Though they weren't in a specific audit review, they were, though, identified by ASIC's finance staff in the collection of material for the ASIC financial statements in both years.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to interrupt there for clarity. It was identified by finance staff, but it was not incorporated in the report.
No, because we don't do an internal audit report at the end of each year in relation to the entirety of the organisation, if you like.
Well, I must have misunderstood, because I thought I heard you say that reports were produced and made available to the commissioners.
They are produced. So what is produced? First of all, there's internal audit reports on specific thematic issues, and then there is an internal audit sign-off, if you like, would use that language, that goes with the financial statements, the preparation of the financial statements, and that sign-off addresses particular matters that arose in the preparation of the material for the financial statements.
So in these reports, this issue that was identified by finance staff within ASIC was not mentioned?
No, that is not correct. I'm sorry, but I think there's been some conflation of the issues because of the way documentation has been made public. The issues that the issue in relation to the rental payments to the Deputy Chair was identified in the process of preparing the financial statements for the previous financial year. That issue was discussed highlighted by the ANAO and ASIC and discussed at the Commission meeting that approved the financial statements and was reflected in the notes to the annual report for that year. The issues that have arisen this year, which is the continued issue in relation to the rental payment and the payments in relation to the relocation expenses of Mr Shipton, again were reflected in the discussion of the ASIC's financial statements and have been reflected in the notes to ASIC's annual report in relation to key management payments.
So can you just be clear to me what you mean when you just say discussion of financial statements? Do you mean a verbal discussion that took place between commissioners, or do you mean a written discussion of the issues identified in the process?
So, like most agencies, when we approve our financial statements, we have a conversation about what were the issues that were relevant to the financial statements. Are there any outstanding issues, and are there any matters to be considered further? And we had that discussion when we approved our financial statements, and we received a paper, at the Commission level, we received a paper flagging that there were issues to be resolved, because at that stage they were unresolved in the interpretation that would be taken in relation to them, with the ANAO in connection with the payments to 2 key management personnel, and those matters, though, with the concurrence of the ANAO, were not relevant to the actual financial statements, but they were relevant to the notations in the financial report.
Okay. Could I ask you to provide copies of any written documents through this process that mention these issues to the committee? I accept you'll have to do that on notice, and hopefully that'll provide us a bit more clarity about what exactly was in and out and in which years. But to summarise, it appears to me that in 2 consecutive financial years, issues with payments to commissioners were identified. They were raised, at least in verbal discussion with commissioners, but not acted upon until the ANAO identified them and raised them this year.
So I don't agree with that characterisation, and I thought my evidence just then was different from that characterisation. Perhaps there's something I haven't been clear enough about. I do note Treasury has organised a review of this entire exercise, and is being conducted by an independent person.
Ms Armour, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're going to have to explain it to me more plainly, and I suspect every other committee member, every other senator on this committee, because your evidence is not clear to me. In fact, it's anything further from clear.
Okay. How could I start in a way that would help you?
To put it very simply, I just want to
build on your building blocks.
To put it very simply, Ms Armour, what I'm trying to understand is how ASIC didn't identify these issues on their own and address them on their own promptly when they first became clear. That's what everybody wants to know. Why was it necessary for the Auditor-General for a second time for 2 years running to bring these issues to ASIC's attention in order for it to be addressed? Okay,
so the second time running, the only second time relates to the rental issue.
One's enough, Ms Armour.
No, I'm not suggesting otherwise. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you the relevant information, that's all. So in relation to that matter, we have said that we agree that matter should have been resolved more efficiently. We accept the failings in having that matter resolved more efficiently.
Okay, so I've taken up a lot of...
Mr Chairman, I might help here. Look, it is fair to say that the matter was raised at a very high level, and it does raise issues of disclosure to the Commission at that time of the detail in last year, and that's a matter that we look forward to the independent review working through. It is fair to say that the Commission did not have ongoing oversight of the follow-through on that observation. And you're right, it is a recommendation in that observation, sort of formal recommendation as per the normal recommendations of the Auditor General, but it is clear that they told us to go away and sort it out with the Rem Tribunal. That did not happen. The Commission did not have oversight of that. The Accountable Authority did have oversight of that, as did the Audit Committee, and I understand that the Audit Committee did raise issues with the slow pace in dealing with the matter. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, and we look forward to hopefully the reviews shedding some light on the processes of ASIC just as much as it does on the individual payments, because it is concerning to me that it is not clear why these issues weren't identified with ASIC's existing processes. I've taken up enough of the committee's time already, and I want to offer the call to Labor senators, but just one final issue to you, Ms Chester, that we'll have to discuss at greater length, but I want to give you an opportunity to address it now when we have our next oversight hearing with the Corporations and Financial Services Committee in November. It seems clear to me that, at least from the evidence available, and perhaps we'll learn more through the answers that you provide on notice in the review, that ASIC's leadership structure is a total mess, and it is totally incapable of addressing what should be an absolutely basic requirement of any regulator, which is to have your own house in order.
Mr Chairman, we very much look forward to working with Dr Vivienne Thom on the independent review, getting the findings of that independent review so it can be fully understood why these failings occurred.
Thank you.